Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynoter. I think an interesting question when we think about what we do as academics and entrepreneurship is the question, what is a thought leader? To me, at least in entrepreneurship, a thought leader is someone who changes the way we look at and understand the world, changes the problems we try to solve, changes the way we solve the problems. A thought leader speaks in a different language, sees things in a different light, opens up parallel and unparalleled universes. They excite us, they irritate us, they motivate us, they confuse us, and ultimately they help us discover ourselves. They are pioneers. They are the Lewis and Clark, the Captain Kirk, going where no one has gone before. To me, this notion of thought leadership is epitomized in Saras Sarasvati. Saras has not simply published papers in good journals. True to the notion of thought leadership, she has created a school of thought. A school of thought that we might call the school of effectuation. Effectuation means to bring about, to effect. What Saras has done for all of us is to remind us that venture creation is not a mechanical act that takes place in a controlled environment, as a business plan model sort of suggests. It is a dynamic process, it is an interactive process, and it takes place in an inherently unpredictable future. Entrepreneurs interact with the venture as they create the future. Saras argues that the unpredictable future is controllable through entrepreneurial action, that the environment is constructible through human choice, that opportunities can be created, that markets can be constructed, not simply catered to, that customers can be led, not simply followed. She argues that entrepreneurial goals, in fact, are negotiated residuals of stakeholder commitments. Her work is fundamentally uncovering new insights into such fundamentally critical questions like what makes entrepreneurs entrepreneurial? How do these individuals take the bold steps that they do take? What does their effectual approach say about the outcomes within ventures? Saras Sarasvati received her PhD in Information Systems from Carnegie Mellon. Her dissertation on entrepreneurial expertise was supervised by Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate. She herself has helped effectuate 5 entrepreneurial ventures. And today she's a faculty member in the Strategy, Entrepreneurship, and Ethics area at the Darden School, University of Virginia. So please join me in warmly welcoming Saras Sarasvati.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Mike, for that warm and generous introduction. I will try to live up to the expectations that you have set up. But before we begin with the presentation, I just want to mention that a lot of building a school of thought, or even just completing some research projects that the way I've been able to be part of and complete is possible only because of a lot of collaborators and a lot of conversations like the one we were just having through our soup and salad. And so I just want to acknowledge a very few of the names, people with whom I've worked very closely and with whom I write. So I just wanted to start with that, thank my collaborators and co-authors before we go ahead. It's my pleasure, it's my privilege to share that journey with you a little bit. And I'm going to present the work not in a normal research format of just simply talking about question, method, and data, although you will see the skeleton of that format in the presentation. But instead, I'm also going to make it personal and kind of explain to you a little bit of the journey that I actually went through in developing some of these ideas and how the ideas evolved over time as more people started working on it. So I'm kind of going to explain the research journey a little bit along the way while talking about what is the content of what came out of the research. So it's really my pleasure to share that with you today, and I hope it is worthwhile spending your lunchtime listening to this. When I first came on the scene in terms of research in academia, I wanted to do research with a question that would be practically and pedagogically relevant, having been an entrepreneur myself. So the question I had begun with was, this was my doctoral dissertation question, was to say, what are the teachable and learnable elements of entrepreneurship? Now, at that point in time, people in research worried a lot about successful entrepreneurship, and we still worry about that today. So a lot of the research is about what explains success, what might lead to failure and how to avoid that. And there was also a bunch of questions about how to be a successful entrepreneur. So there is research from psychology that looked at what makes a successful entrepreneur or what makes an entrepreneur as opposed to non-entrepreneurs. Now, there were some really interesting pieces with these questions, and there were also a lot of mixed results. I wanted to ask a slightly different question. Like a lot of doctoral students, we want to also product differentiate a little bit. And so my issue was to say, if you have been an entrepreneur for years and years and years, you've been through successes and failures in multiple ventures, is there something that you have learned that I can learn and teach in the classroom? But more importantly, to go beyond just the how-tos of entrepreneurship, how to do market research, how to do financial projections, how to write a business plan, how to pitch, to go a little bit beyond that. So it would also be theoretically a new way of looking at the phenomenon. So the idea was to try to look at entrepreneurial experience and what I call expertise, and I will explain that in a minute. I happened to be at Carnegie Mellon University, where there was a tradition of studying how human beings think. So this is not the kind of psychology where you study attributes of people through surveys or psychometric instruments. This was much more problem-solving techniques on how people actually think and make decisions. And in this school, there was a tradition. In fact, people had studied expertise in a variety of domains, and they had actually even helped develop some of the methods. So as a doctoral student, it was very easy for me to go and choose a method from the field of expertise to study how entrepreneurs experience being entrepreneurs and what they learn through their experience. So that is where the story begins. And the method is called protocol analysis, and it's very simple if I just explain it to you in terms of what you actually do rather than all the jargon that is kind of associated with it. So basically the idea is, if you're an expert in something, let's say you are a very experienced doctor who has a good reputation for excellent medical diagnosis. The idea is to present you with problems from your domain of expertise and have you think aloud continuously as you solve the problem. We tape you, and we tape a whole bunch of such experts, and then we analyze them across and say, is there a common way of solving this problem that forms the basis of thinking well to be a good diagnostician, for example? A really simple example of that would be if I asked you to multiply 24 by 32, but I don't give you a paper and pen, and I ask you to think continuously, talk continuously as you do it. So here what it allows me to do is to look inside your head just a little bit. So not only will I know whether you can indeed multiply 24 by 32 without a calculator, and not many people can do that anymore these days, but I will also know a little bit about, where you went to school, or what kind of arithmetic you know, or what level of mathematics. So I can actually trace. So some of us would, just simply imagine a paper and pen, and depending on which school you went to, 24 times 32, you would do 4 times 2 and 2 times 2, and you would add up. I mean, that's how I was taught to do arithmetic. There might be other people who went through the Trachtenberg system, or somebody who's an expert mathematician who just looks at it and knows the answer. So the idea is we can actually trace how you solve the problem, what kinds of information you look at, what kinds of information you ignore. So I get to know not just the decision you make, but how you think about the decisions. So this was the basis of the method. And just to tell you what an expert entrepreneur is, the way I defined it for the dissertation was somebody who had at least 15 years of founding entrepreneurial experience, who had founded multiple firms, including 1 or 2 failures, and taken at least 1 company public. So that was the definition of an expert entrepreneur. As you can imagine, there are not many people who qualify into that population. Based on all the sources that I could put together, I found 245 of these entrepreneurs. And I wrote to all of them, and 45 of them accepted to participate in this study. So now think about this. I had to develop an instrument that consisted of typical decisions that people make in the startup phase of a company. So it turned out to be a 17-page problem set of 10 typical decisions. And now you have 45 of these people. You can always go interview them, you can survey them, you can get the histories of the companies they started, all that material was available. But on top of that, I also have all these guys, and they were all guys, and we can talk about that if you want a little bit later. They were all looking at exactly the same 17-page problem set, and these are complex problems. They're not questionnaire-type problems. And they are all trying to make the same kind of decisions, if you will. So it was wonderful to have something that you could actually compare across all these entrepreneurs, and then say, here are some things that are common. And the inference, therefore, is that maybe they learned this through their entrepreneurial experience. And to ensure that that is how it actually happened, I went to some length to actually choose entrepreneurs from a variety of different industries. So it turned out that we have the usual suspects, right, software and biotech, but also retail, personal services, a railroad company, a steel company, teddy bears, ice cream, you can name it. So it's a whole bunch of variety of experiences in a variety of industries and technologies. All that they had in common really was entrepreneurial experience. So that's kind of the setup. So I had written to them that I would need 2 hours of their time. I had done a lot of pilots to find out how much time it takes for a typical entrepreneur to go through that problem set. And it took a long time, I will tell you, to design this. And no matter what I told them, and there were reasons why they agreed to give me so much of their time, when I walked into their office, they are usually, sitting back, relaxed. I mean, those of you who work with entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs yourself, they're good at telling a good story, and they've told it many times. So they expect a young student to walk in, and they're going to tell their story again, no matter what I wrote to them on what the experimental method would be. So I would go in, I would put this 17-page document in front of them, take out my tape recorder, put it over there, and then I would tell them, thank you so much for your time, please start reading. Because the whole point of the method is that I don't interfere in how they, and then I had an unstructured interview that I did afterwards, but in the beginning it was always a shock, and instructions on how to do it and a little exercise up front was all part of the instrument. So I just want to take you with me on what this research consisted of. So I went across 18 different states in the US, and they were all US entrepreneurs, although some of them were immigrants. And it was just this wonderful experience. And going in, what do you think the hypothesis was? I'm at a really strong research-based university, and the hypothesis going in was, why should these people be any different than anybody else? Look at the psych literature, it's all over the place. They're human beings, and the prevailing theory in economics at the time, and to some extent even today, is look at the statistics of failures and successes. These people are all in the tails. They got lucky, right? So going in, the hypothesis was that there shouldn't be anything very common across these people except the fact that, they're all guys, they're human beings. Maybe they have a lot of money, so maybe you expect to see a certain amount of arrogance or overconfidence or something like that. So going in, the hypothesis was there shouldn't be anything that different about this group of people in terms of the way they think. Luckily for me, it turned out that there was something peculiar and interesting. And of course, like all results in research involving human behavior, you're never going to find 100%. In fact, you'd be very afraid if you find 100%. But the results were quite strong that 2/3 of these entrepreneurs, more than 3/4 of the time, had a particular logic to the way they approach the decisions in building a company. So the rest of the presentation, I want to tell you a little bit about that. And again, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the work came afterwards with a lot of other collaborators, and a lot of people's ideas have gone into building some of these things that I'm going to talk about. Oh, by the way, I call it effectual logic or effectuation. You don't have to buy the word per se, but as academics, we needed to have a way of talking about this as a coherent set of logical principles on which and to be able to talk about all of them together, so I had to come up with a name, and I will explain to you where the name came from in a minute. So this is some subsequent research after the first thing was done. So when I first went out on the job market and I would present this, people would immediately, oh, you studied only successful entrepreneurs, there's the comparison group. Since then, we have been doing a little bit of work along with collaborators. We have looked at novices, we have looked at corporate managers. There are other studies that have looked at small business. There are people who have looked at organic growth leaders. And then, of course, this method is really, really tedious and difficult. 1,500 pages of data, 80 hours of tape. To analyze that takes a long time, a lot of effort. So eventually, when we started becoming a little bit more on what we think was going on, we developed a survey instrument that picked out one important piece of that logic and looked at it. And now we have survey data pouring in from many different countries. We are now, of course, I can just stand at a street corner and administer the survey. Anybody can fill it out. And so we're getting a lot of data from the entrepreneurial community, including angels and VCs, and even the support professionals who are involved in the entrepreneurial community. And so let me give you a quick summary. This is a very impressionistic summary. Some of it is really good data. Some of it is we are making a leap from the data, and some of it is hypotheses that other people are working on in projects that I've not been involved in. But I kind of wanted to give you a quick picture of what it looks like. So if you think about a continuum or a kind of a two extremes of a way of thinking about this logic, there does seem to be a pattern that people fall into, that the expert entrepreneurs are highly effectual, and I have not gotten to that yet, what that means, and I will in a minute. And you can see that the corporate managers are on kind of the other side of the spectrum. But some interesting results with regard to angels and VCs. The angels tend to think and use a lot of the techniques that expert entrepreneurs do. And we expected the VCs to be the exact opposite. And we found to our interest that the VCs are indeed very different, because a lot of them do come out of our MBA programs. Or from investment banking or some other field which is much more causal. But then when we actually tried to do the analysis on experience of the VCs, it turns out that the more experienced VCs kind of moved more towards the expert entrepreneurs. We also have some interesting data on entrepreneurial large firms, the 3Ms of the world, that actually seem to be able to straddle both worlds or mix and match and balance. Okay, so now for the interesting part, going back to the research. When I first started going on this journey, many of you, I'm sure, interact with entrepreneurs all the time, and if you give them the problem set the way I did, and you ask them to make some decisions on building a firm, they talk colorfully, very interesting, and they bring in their experiences, and initially it just sounds like entrepreneurs, talking. And as a doctoral student, it was very difficult for me to say, like, what is going on here? They just sound like a lot of entrepreneurs that I've heard. So I started looking for nuggets of repetitions of things that they would say. And very quickly, almost by the time I got to the third entrepreneur, I began to notice one thing that was very clear, and that was they would always say something about, I hate market research. Right? Somewhere they're going to say something nasty about market research. And some of them would hold forth for 10 minutes, like a tirade on why you should not look at market research data, and some of them would just say more. So I just wanted to share with you the raw data so you can take a look at it. So, I don't believe in market research actually. I just go sell it. Excuse me. Traditional market research says you do very broad-based information gathering, possibly using mailings. I wouldn't do that. I would literally target, as I said initially, key companies who I would call flagship and do a frontal lobotomy on them. I think you have to be right in there, eyeball into the reality of what does a customer look like. I believe very much in the sort of Studs-Terkel's approach. And for those of you who know about the sociologist, famous sociologist Studs-Terkel, he would get on a bus and actually talk to people, but he could always capture the soul of the person just through the conversation, if you read Working, his very famous book. So they was talking about the Studs-Terkel approach. So as I would come back, I had rather intelligent advisors who would ask me, so what are you learning? What do you think you know now that you didn't know the last time we met? And I would say, these people really, really hate market research. And then my advisor said, that's very interesting, but that's not a dissertation, right? Expert entrepreneurs hate market research cannot be a thesis, so if you have to graduate, you have to say. So the idea was to start thinking about, what do they mean by they hate? What do they mean by market research? If they're not doing market research, what else are they doing? Why do they hate this? So going back and digging into all that is what led me to the logic that I'm going to present. So the next step was to go a little bit back into the data and look at it, and we found expert entrepreneurs hate market research. Okay, we know that. But it turned out that they underweight or they altogether ignore or actively resist all predictive information of all kinds, not all predictive, but predictive information of all kinds. They prefer to work with things within their control. They always look for what's in my control, what's not in my control, and what can I do with the things that I have in my control, rather than going out and chasing things that I don't have in my control. They prefer changing goals to chasing means that they do not have. So it goes with working with what they have control over. So they're not saying, okay, this business is going to cost $2 million, so let me go try to get $2 million. They're much more looking at, well, I got like 200,000, I can probably get Mike to invest another 50. What can we do with 250? It is much more of that kind of thinking. They were very open to surprises. They almost seemed to look forward to things going wrong in some ways, or they would say things like, well, whatever plans you make, things will most probably go wrong, and if nothing has gone wrong so far, you better not sleep well. Sleep with one eye open tonight. And they were very keen on shaping and making opportunities rather than on finding them. So since a lot of the research, even today, is about recognizing opportunities or discovering opportunities and finding opportunities, it became a little confusing for me to start thinking about what does this mean in terms of shaping and making the future, making opportunities. So in one sense, if you come back to it and you look at the MBA textbooks on entrepreneurship, the MBA textbooks on marketing, and thereafter you start looking at ops or HR or strategy, you suddenly start realizing that there is this theme about prediction that goes on in a lot of what we teach MBA students. And that a lot of that is what I call causal or predictive logic. And the logic is very simple. To the extent you can predict the future, you can control it. It's a very good idea. I mean, if you know it's going to rain, you can carry an umbrella. It's as simple as that. But in actual fact, if you can actually predict where the demand is going to be or how the technology is going to change, it stands to reason that you will be able to create better outcomes. You'll be able to control your own future better. So this control of outcomes in this logic is achieved through, investing in accurate predictions, setting clear goals, and then making things happen the way you plan them to be to avoid surprises. In fact, invest in strategies that avoid surprises, that deviate from the plan. You can look at any issue in strategy, in marketing, choosing between two different market segments, or if you think about hiring people, we try to predict how well they will perform. A lot of what we talk about in MBA program is predictive. It's based on this logic that if you can predict better, you can control it. And we do the same thing in business plans. We teach people how to do market research, how to do financial projections, and how to make a great plan. Well, it turns out that the expert entrepreneurs were doing almost the inverse of this logic, and hence the idea of effectual as opposed to causal logic. So you don't begin with clear goals towards which you make accurate predictions and then you make the plan happen. Instead, you're going to do something very different. And the question is, what exactly would you do? So the moment you take the notion of prediction and control, and instead of saying that, prediction gives you control, if you separate it out, you dichotomize it, you get our useful 2x2s, where you have a high prediction, low prediction, and high control and low control. And as Kawasaki was talking in the morning, we all like the upper right-hand quadrant. A lot of entrepreneurs like that, right? We would all like to be in a world where we can predict the future and we can make it happen. So Microsoft is a dream company, right? We already know the road ahead, and then we make sure no other road happens in some ways. So at least that's the target. That's the dream quadrant, the visionary idea. I have a view of the world, and I'm going to persist in it. So in a smaller way, you can think about it to teach students that, you have a vision. Maybe nobody believes in it, but you got to believe in it. You got to go for it. You got to make it happen, no matter, what anybody says about it in some ways. It's a kind of a pig-headed visionary logic there. But most of us are a lot more commonsensical than that, and we know that the future is difficult to predict, and so we don't really go completely, off the wall on our predictions and invest in it. But we do try to invest in better and more accurate predictions, and we try to some extent to also be prepared for something's going wrong. Which brings me to a lot of the strategy literature where we talk about adaptation, because we live in a world where technology changes fast, business is global, so competition comes at you from all kinds of areas, and so you get nimble, you get flexible, you start adapting, you get quicker on your feet to some extent to change your. So that's the adaptive kind of logic. But here were the expert entrepreneurs. They were in this bottom right-hand one, where it is really low on prediction and high on control. And so the question became for me, how the heck do you control a future you cannot predict? And that was the essence of the logic and the principles that I had to chase in getting out of it and in the future work that we did. So now for the real meat of what is this, how do you control a future you cannot predict? I'm going to spend a couple of slides on that, and then present to you some work from real-life entrepreneurs. So we'll get out of the research and talk about some real entrepreneurs too. So it turns out so far from the data and all the different pieces that we have been doing, we have been able to cull together about 5 principles that I will talk to you about. The first one is the idea that you work with things within your control. So you start with who you are, what you know, and whom you know, and not with some opportunity that is out there. So here's the idea. And here I like to give the example of cooking, and it seems particularly appropriate during lunch to do this. How many of you cook? All right? So if I were to ask you, just based on what I have said so far, how many of you cook causally? What would that mean? Recipes, right? You kind of start with, here's what I want to cook, bring out your best grandma's recipe, go buy the best ingredients, make sure you have the proper utensils, and you make the dish. All right, if we were to cook effectually, where do you think we would start? Stumble into the refrigerator, that's what I do. I love to cook. You open the door and look at what you have, and you start thinking, let me throw this together into something. Okay, now the kicker question, which do you think tastes better? Effectual. Anybody who wanted to stand up for the causal guy? Pardon? And look where she is and where we are in our cooking, right? Absolutely. I do this with students, and we spend a little bit more time, but it turns out that a good cook is a good cook, whether causal or effectual, and still depends on how good you are as a cook to some extent. So, you can have somebody who can cook very well, and you can give them, cardboard and salt, and they probably can whip up a dish. And then you have people like my husband where, I give him the easiest 20-minute recipes, and when I come back, he's eating chickpeas out of the can, right? Because it tastes horrible. And the issue really is not, we still have to learn all these how-tos, how do you make a pitch, and you have to learn a lot of those things. It's not really just about the mode of thinking, but there is one difference that is crucial. That is, if you do it effectually, you're much more likely to come up with something new. So you're much more likely to come up with something that you yourself didn't imagine, and certainly your grandmother didn't imagine it. So the novelty aspect of it is kind of interesting there. So it is in that sense that the opportunity doesn't simply exist out there. You end up creating new opportunities that you yourself may not have dreamed of. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, especially when you go from cooking to building a restaurant, which I'll talk about in a minute. But let's go on to the next one. So the next one is, again, and you can see the contrasting principles on the other side. When we teach in finance, for example, pick between project A and project B, we tell people to do some kind of, predict future cash flows and do an NPV analysis, and you want to pick the project with a better expected return. This is also true for Porter's analysis of which market segment you want to pick to, for example. Here, the expert entrepreneurs do the inverse of that. And what they do is they use something called the affordable loss principle. So they're looking at, well, how much can I afford to lose on this venture? Now, this does two things. One is you're working with things within your control, within the money that you actually have. And it's also making you think, like, would I do this even if I lose that money that I invest? So that becomes a criterion. So the typical example I give here is that of what I call the plunge decision, right? I teach at Darden. A lot of my students, they make way more money than I do when they're done with the school. So if somebody is making $200,000 a year and resigns, and this is actually one of the students at Darden, and decided to start dog water company, bottled water, it's in cups, bottled water for dogs. The guy is working with IBM. And you think, like, how could he possibly make that decision? And as researchers, the only explanations, either he's overconfident, just plain crazy, or he loves to take a risk. But I wrote a case on this, and you actually talk to the person about how they make the decision, and it turns out that it's not that crazy. He actually is thinking in terms of, I really hate working for IBM. I want to do something different. I don't know anything much on what to do. I don't have any technology background or anything. But I do love dogs, and I saw dogs drinking out of the rain puddles in Central Park. This guy was in New York. And he said, you know what, there has to be a better way. And how much is it going to cost me to actually try this out? Put some water and things and put it in a couple of retail spaces. I happen to know somebody who's in the retail distribution area. Let's try it out. Let's check it out. And the way he raised funds was he would go to other Darden alumni and friends, and he would tell them, he asked people to give him like $5,000 in return for a business card saying they are part of the founding team of this company. And he said it's a great way to pick up chicks. He had a lot of unmarried friends. And his pitch to them was, guys, I can't promise you anything, it's dog water. But if we make it big, right, we're going to make a lot of money. And so when you think about it, it's much more a question of, so to give a more sober example, people make decisions like, I'm 40 years old, kids are at a stage where they're standing or beginning to stand on their own feet, and I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. If I don't do this now, when will I ever do it? Maybe I'll take 100,000 from our savings. I'll give it 6 months. Maybe if it doesn't work out, I'll come back, and I may not get a $200,000 job, but I may still get a $100,000 job. And you kind of make the decision. So it does two things, as I said. It kind of helps you make the decision to do it within resources, within your control, but also kind of is a test. Would you do this even if you lost the money? Is that important to you? So that's the affordable loss principle. The next one, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the next slide too. The next one is another interesting one, where you basically start with who you are, what you know, and whom you know, and then you're actually kind of stitching together this quilt with the people who actually want to come on board, the self-selected stakeholders. So here the example I like to give is when you are hiring somebody. Are you going to find the right person for the job? Are you going to go look for somebody who will apply for the job and pitch you on why they want to come aboard your company, and that they will come only if you give them a 15% raise? So a lot of my students would say things like, yeah, sure, I will find the best person and I will offer them a better rate than market value, and I will give them equity, right? And I usually tell them that's not the way to put together a team if you want to do entrepreneurship the way the experts would do. You actually want to get somebody who has 20 other offers and ask them what kind of a pay cut they will take to come work for you. And if they cannot imagine a potential in your business where they are going to increase value and they don't negotiate hard on equity and are willing to take a pay cut, you don't want them. So the expert entrepreneurs would say things like it's the choose me test. You want the guy who's breaking down your door and saying, I will come on board and I will create this much value and therefore I will have this much, rather than somebody who wants market value. If they expect to get market value, they probably don't understand an entrepreneurial firm. So this notion of self-selected stakeholders is something we'll talk about a lot more, because it's very interesting how that process actually happens over and over again in an entrepreneurial company. Of course, if you do all this, if you take this path, this kind of a logic of building a company, you have to be good with surprises, because surprises do happen. So this is the old saying, when life throws lemons at you, make lemonade. A lot of the expert entrepreneurs are really good at taking the unexpected things that you don't normally even consider as part of your venture, and also things that really go wrong, and transforming them into something that creates value and ends up doing something completely different. And over again, you see this example in a lot of different companies. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of them, but I have a lot of stories. If you're interested, I can email them to you. The last one is, of course, all of this logic is based on the inversion of the logic of causal thinking, which is the idea that the future actually comes from what people do, that there is no such things as inevitable trends, that ultimately a lot of what we do as entrepreneurs is about getting people to put their hands in their pocket and write a check that will not bounce for enough of money so that we can stay in business. And to the extent that you can get people to do that, you don't need a $2 billion market. A lot of what Kawasaki was talking about in the morning spoke to that too. You don't need a multi-billion-dollar market. You just need enough people investing enough to keep going. And then you build that into the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and it grows. So going back to the cooking and the restaurant, you can see this. I put the example of Caesar salad, on the wrong slide. I apologize. Let's go over this one first, which is the notion of the self-selected stakeholders. So you start with who you are, what you know, and whom you know. And you start thinking, given who I am, what I know, and whom I know, what are some of the things I can do? And almost the first thing you do, you start interacting with other people. You start talking to other people. And in talking to other people, what you're trying to do is to get them to move to a commitment. And I do this little example in class. Let's say you have a little green pen, and you have the idea of a green pen, and that's the venture you want to do. Now, when you go around and ask people, you're going to get all kinds of inputs. The people who are going to say, that's the coolest green pen I've ever seen. That very rarely happens. Most of the time, people are saying, what's so interesting about a green pen? They're going to be very negative. But sooner or later, somebody starts saying, you know what? maybe if it was blue and if it had a little microchip in it, maybe then I would like to take it. And then I asked the students, now what do? You get a lot of this kind of information when you go out there, and you get, some people love it, some people hate it, they tell you you want to do this, you want to do that. Let's say somebody says, if it was blue, if you had a little microchip embedded in it, I think I would buy 10,000. Now you can either persist, the visionary logic, and say, you know what, I want to make a green pen, I ain't making it blue. Maybe there is a whole bunch of people out there, I'll find the people who want the blue pen, want the green pen, and I'm not making the blue pen. That's one way to react to it. And you go on searching for the green pen world. Or you can say, you know what, this is a good prediction. Apparently the customer, the market, wants blue pens with chips. Let's do blue pens with chips. But before that, let's make sure there are enough number of people who want blue pens. So let's do a little bit more market research on blue pens versus green pens, and then we will pick one of them. That's kind of the predictive logic. The third thing you can do is to say, okay, customer wants blue, all right, I'm going to find the money. I got one customer who says if it is blue and chip, he or she will buy, and you go, and that's kind of the adaptive logic. But the expert entrepreneurs is saying, don't do any of that. Go back to that person and say, what's it worth to you to make it blue with a chip, right? So, will you give me the money for the mold? Will you call up 10 other people to whom you will sell enough so that we'll break even? And so the idea is to move only commitment by commitment. So you're not trying to predict it, you're actually trying to bring people on board, and you're always trying to get them to self-select into it. So it's worth enough for them that they actually want to be part of your venture. So each time, though, somebody actually commits something, they're going to bring new resources to the table. But they also are going to try and change it. It's not a green pen anymore. Now you're pitching a blue pen with a chip. So the resources keep getting increased. Who I am becomes now who we are. So we got 2 people making calls, 2 people pitching. We are increasing the resources in many ways, but we're also kind of putting some constraints on what the business model is going to look like, what the opportunity is going to shape up to be. And over a period of time, and this is what a lot of the expert entrepreneurs told me, 5 years into the business, you don't know what business you're in. You're lucky if at the end of 5 years you can actually define it and say, okay, this is the business I'm in. And this was very surprising to me in a venture capital world where in 5 years you're supposed to have already made your billions or gone bust. So a lot of them talked a lot about how you go through this process. And at each point in the process, each stakeholder is investing only what he or she can afford to lose. So what happens is it turns out that you're spreading the risk in many ways, but you're also kind of, by the time you've actually built the new venture and the new market, you already paid for it through the stakeholders who have already bought into it. So it's not like you have a business model and then you're going out and selling that business model per se. So the details of how this process happens is very, very interesting. So far I've given you a lot of information very, very quickly in 2 slides. What I would like to do next is to kind of take you to the real world again and have the entrepreneurs talk to you about it themselves. So in the cooking example, I usually like to use Caesar salad because there is a story about Caesar salad that a VIP came to a famous chef's restaurant, and the restaurant had already closed, and they had to serve something, and they wanted a salad. And these just happened to be the ingredients they had, and they put that together, and, rest is history. So I put that. It's a very factual kind of story. I don't know if it's true or not. But imagine you have to go from cooking to actually building a venture. So what happens here is you might start out by saying, I'm a good cook, I want to start this great restaurant, but then usually you don't have the money to start the restaurant. What you really are is a good cook. So maybe you invite a bunch of people to dinner, and then maybe they like your food, and maybe you start a little catering business. And I'll share with you a small experience that I had myself, which was I took some food to my cousin who was working downtown in a large, multi-story building in Bombay, and I brought lunch for her, and I tried to get a couple of her colleagues to eat lunch, and that started a little lunch service business. And it grew to such an extent, you go to the next room, the next floor, the next building, and slowly the business grows. And then I hired somebody to actually deliver it because I couldn't do it myself. And then it turned out that orders dropped. So I was like, what happened? And I went back and they said it's not really the food, we kind of liked your coming over, you're kind of weird. So this happens, right, to people. And the question is now, what do you do? Like, what exactly are you selling here? And in my case, I don't want to get into my story too much, but I do this exercise in class, and students always come up with, maybe you should do something. Maybe you should make a video. Or maybe you should teach cooking instead of making food, if the personality. So the question, what happens is, you learn about yourself. Your own vision of who you are and what you know and everything also changes through the entrepreneurial process. And that's why very often you end up somewhere where you yourself may not have thought you would end up in. So just so that mine is not the only voice you hear on this, I want to share with you the story of an actual entrepreneur. Somebody in Denmark last year actually sent me this video clip, which I want to share with you. This was an entrepreneur, Klaus Meyer, of the Meyer Group.
Then your first question, that was even more difficult to say anything intelligent about.
Let it.
How would I compare entrepreneurship with cooking? Well, there are many similarities, I would say. I dance around and see what happens and try to feel the energy. But I'm sure that there are maybe more brighter ways of doing it. But from my perspective, it is very much the same thing.
All right, this is at the Copenhagen Business School, and Klaus Meyer owns 9 companies now. He owns vineyards, dairy, oil and vinegar. And when he was at CBS, people thought he was crazy because all he wanted to do was to start a little Nordic restaurant. He called it Nordic cuisine, and people laughed. Nordic cuisine is an oxymoron. And it turns out last year they actually have formed this consortium of chefs from the Scandinavian area, and they have created a manifesto that they claim is Nordic cuisine, and it's kind of a hot item in Europe in a big way. But if you look at the story, people sent me this because they had said this is the textbook effectuation, what this guy did. Because of the paper, I had actually written the cooking story. And you can see that even the other elements are there, that he actually talks about the dishwasher who could be a florist. So you're not just hiring people for particular job descriptions. You're hiring people, you're working with them, and where they go is where the business goes to some extent. And here's one more, if you want to think about some histories. So for research-wise, the questions are, where the markets, when you look at case histories or studies, one of the questions I ask myself, were the markets already there, or were they made, and if so, how? Did the opportunities make the entrepreneurs, or did the entrepreneurs make these opportunities? And I've given you just a selection of real-world businesses. So Starbucks is another interesting one. You can ask people, if you actually go to Nancy Kane's History of Starbucks and you look at the data that Starbucks had in the 1980s, for 20 years, coffee consumption had been going down in the US. And if you say now, make your pitch for Starbucks, I'm the venture capitalist. In your pitch is, I'm going to sell $5 coffee or whatever, $2 coffee at the time. Question is, how would you do that? And if you actually go look at the history of Starbucks, of course, that's not the way things happen at all, right? And you can look at the histories of each one of these stories, and you can start asking these questions and see if the dynamic model that I presented to you, starting with who I am, what I know, and whom I know, and then building through self-selected stakeholders and leveraging all kinds of weird surprises that happen along the way. You can actually trace that pattern in the histories of these companies. So this is Pierre Omidyar on eBay, just to give you like a non-cooking technical example. This may be a little difficult to read, so I'm going to try and read it for you. Almost every industry analyst and business reporter I talk to observes that eBay's strength is that its system is self-sustaining, able to adapt to user needs without any heavy intervention from a central authority of some sort. So people often say to me, when you build a system, you must have known that making it self-sustainable was the only way eBay could grow to serve 40 million users a day. Guess what's coming next? Well, no. I made the system self-sustaining for one reason. Back when I launched eBay on Labor Day '95, eBay wasn't my business. It was my hobby. I had to build a system that was self-sustaining because I had a real job to go to every morning. I was working as a software engineer from 10 to 7, and I wanted to have a life on the weekends. So I built a system that could keep working, catching complaints and capturing feedback, even when Pam and I were out mountain biking, and the only one home was our cat. And he goes on. If I had had a blank check from a big VC and a big staff running around, things might have gone much worse. I would have probably put together a very complex, elaborate system, something that justified all the investment. But because I had to operate on a tight budget, tight in terms of money and tight in terms of time, necessity focused me on simplicity. So I built a system simple enough to sustain itself. By building a simple system with just a few guiding principles, eBay was open to organic growth. It could achieve a certain degree of self-organization. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is, whatever future you're building, don't try to program everything. 5-year plans never worked for the Soviet Union. In fact, if anything, central planning contributed to its fall. Chances are central planning won't work any better for any of us. Build a platform, prepare for the unexpected, and you will know you're successful when the platform you have built serves you in unexpected ways. That's certainly true of the lessons I've learned in the process of building eBay. Because in the deepest sense, eBay wasn't a hobby, and it wasn't a business. It was and is a community, an organic, evolving, self-organizing web of individual relationships formed around shared interest. In some ways, that captures the philosophy behind effectuation very well. That it's not really just great ventures or not just great ventures. They're actually communities. So I'm going to end with this last slide, and maybe we'll have time for just a question or two. So a lot of what we teach is kind of this jigsaw puzzle idea that there are all these bits and pieces that go into a venture. You got to get the right pieces and put them in the right place, and the picture becomes very clear. And then later on, people ask you, "My God, how could you see this picture? How come nobody else could see it?" And some ventures are indeed that way. There are visionary entrepreneurs. There are entrepreneurs who are very good at putting together the jigsaw puzzle of what the opportunity should be. But, I didn't mean to do that. But a lot of the research from the group that I am participating in is also showing that there may be another way to build a great venture. And that is more like, that's a zari quilt from India. You know, usually it's women in a village who build the quilt together. Different people come with different baskets of fabrics, and there's usually kind of an initiator or a head quilter who kind of decides on the initial pattern, how it goes through. And at any given point of time, you can't quite predict what the final quilt is going to look like, because it's going to depend on what patches come the next day, and there are like beads and sequins and all that. But then at the end of it, the idea is for the entrepreneur to stitch together something that is beautiful, that makes meaning, as Kawasaki said. But then ultimately, it has to keep the person warm too. So it has to be practically useful and valuable, and hopefully people will pay for it. So with that, I would like to kind of end the presentation and take a couple of questions, or if we have the time, or if we don't have the time, we can just end here. You think we should end here? We're out of time. Thank you very much. Yes.
Wasn't that great? In the spirit